There's a specific moment, so small almost nobody notices it happening, that separates the person who eventually becomes wealthy from the person who spends a lifetime wishing they were. It isn't talent. It isn't luck. It isn't even hard work, whatever you've been told. It takes about 4 seconds, inside a single mind, and most people who cross it couldn't tell you it happened at all. You've wanted to be rich. Almost everyone has, in some quiet hour, doing math on a bill that hurt more than it should have, watching someone else's life and wondering what they know that you don't. But wanting was never the problem. Wanting has never once been the thing standing between a person and the money they kept hoping would show up. In a few minutes, I'll show you the exact line almost nobody crosses, and the one story that proves what happens the moment someone finally does. If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success, so I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. Let me start with someone you'd probably recognize if you met him at a dinner party, because I think a piece of him lives in most people who click on a video with this title. His name was Curtis, an insurance adjuster in his early 40s, and for 12 years running he could tell you, in impressive detail, exactly how he was going to build wealth. He owned the books, highlighted in all the right places, the way people do when they want the highlighting to count as progress. He listened to interviews with self-made men on his commute, nodding along in traffic. He'd made a vision board once, at his wife's suggestion, and kept it taped inside a closet door where he saw it every morning without quite looking at it anymore. Ask Curtis if he wanted to be financially free, and he'd answer before you finished the question. Of course, who wouldn't? He'd talk about it with real feeling, the kind that isn't faked, the kind that comes from somewhere true. And yet 12 years passed, then 13, and the actual shape of his life, the job, the hours, the amount sitting in the account at the end of each month, hadn't moved in any direction you could call deliberate. Here's what I want you to notice, because it's easy to miss the first time you hear it. Curtis wasn't lazy. He wasn't undisciplined in the ways people usually mean that word. He showed up early. He raised 2 kids who turned out fine. He ran 3 miles most mornings before the rest of the house woke up. Whatever was standing between him and the life he kept describing so vividly, it wasn't a lack of effort in general. It was something narrower, something almost nobody ever names correctly, and once you see it in Curtis, you'll start noticing it everywhere, possibly including somewhere closer to home than you'd like. Every plan Curtis ever made for his own wealth had a door left open behind it. Not consciously, he'd have denied it if you'd said it to his face, but structurally, in the architecture of what he told himself. He was going to start the side business once things settled down. He was going to invest more aggressively once he'd built a bigger cushion, a cushion whose size kept quietly revising upward every time he got close to it. He was going to have the hard conversation with his wife about cutting expenses once the timing felt right. And the timing, examined honestly, never once felt right, not for a single week in 13 years. I want to be precise about what was actually happening there, because it's more specific than he lacked motivation, a phrase so vague it explains nothing. Curtis had a wish, a real one, urgent enough to keep him reading books and listening to podcasts for over a decade. What he never had, not once in that entire stretch, was a decision. And those two things feel almost identical from the inside, which is exactly why so few people ever notice they've spent years living on the wrong one. A wish keeps every option open. That's what makes it feel safe, and it's exactly what makes it useless. A wish lets you keep the current job, the current spending, the current schedule, and simply add wanting on top of all of it, like a coat draped over furniture you have no intention of moving. It costs nothing, which is exactly why it changes nothing. You can wish for 20 years without a single day of your life looking different, because a wish was never built to cost you anything. A decision is a different animal, and I don't mean that as a motivational phrase. I mean it structurally. The way an architect means a support wall is different from a curtain. A real decision closes a door. It removes an option that used to sit there, quietly, as an escape hatch, and it does that on purpose, because the option's existence was letting you avoid the very thing you claimed to want. Curtis never once, in 13 years, closed a single door. He accumulated intentions instead, stacking one on top of the last, each sincere, each weightless, because none had ever cost him anything to hold. I asked him once, near the end of that stretch, what would actually have to happen for him to stop merely wanting this and start doing something about it that couldn't be quietly walked back later. He sat with the question longer than I expected. And what he said next is the exact thread I'm going to pull on for the rest of this video, because it wasn't really an answer. It was a confession he hadn't planned on making, and it's the same confession, in some version or another, that I think you're closer to than you'd like to admit. Here's what Curtis actually said, as close to word for word as I can give it to you. He said if he ever really decided, if he cleared out the savings, quit the job, or told his wife with total seriousness that this was happening now, not someday, and it still didn't work, he wouldn't have anything left to tell himself. Right now, he explained, he still got to believe he could do it. He just hadn't gotten around to trying yet, not for real. The moment he actually tried, with nothing held back, he'd find out for certain whether that belief had ever been true at all, and some part of him, he admitted, quieter than his voice usually got, would rather not know. Sit with that for a second, because I think it's the actual engine underneath almost every unrealized ambition you've ever watched someone carry for years without moving. Not fear of failure in the dramatic sense, not the fear of losing money or looking foolish. Something colder and harder to spot. The fear of losing the story. As long as Curtis never fully committed, he got to keep an unfalsifiable version of himself alive indefinitely. The man who could have built real wealth, if circumstances had ever lined up. The instant he committed everything and it failed, that version of him would die, replaced by a plainer, more painful fact. He'd tried, with everything he had, and it hadn't been enough. A wish protects that story. That's its entire function, whether anyone doing the wishing realizes it or not. A wish lets you keep believing in a version of yourself that's never actually been tested, and untested beliefs are remarkably comfortable to hold, precisely because reality never gets the chance to argue back. The moment you make a real decision, the kind that closes a door, the kind that can't be quietly walked back next month, you hand reality the microphone. And some part of almost everyone would rather keep talking forever than risk hearing what reality has to say back. There's a well-documented pattern in behavioral economics that lands almost exactly here, called status quo bias, the tendency to strongly prefer things staying as they are, even when the current situation is measurably worse than an available alternative, simply because change introduces the possibility of a loss that inaction never has to risk. Researchers have found it operating in decisions as small as which retirement plan someone defaults into, and as large as which career someone stays in for 30 years past the point it stopped serving them. Loss looms larger in the mind than an equivalent gain, so a person will tolerate an ongoing, familiar disappointment far longer than they'll risk a sharp, unfamiliar one, even when the familiar disappointment is, by any honest measure, the larger cost over time. Curtis wasn't choosing comfort over wealth, not exactly. He was choosing the certainty of an untested story over the risk of a tested one, and I don't think he's unusual for that. I think he's the rule almost nobody says out loud. Napoleon Hill spent a long section of his work on exactly this fork in the road, describing what he called definiteness of purpose, not as a motivational phrase to hang on a wall, but as a specific, almost mechanical distinction between a person who has fixed their aim on one clear outcome and closed the doors behind it, and a person who keeps every door open at once and calls the resulting paralysis flexibility. He was blunt about which one actually produces wealth, and blunter still about how rare real definiteness turns out to be once you start looking for it honestly in the people around you, including yourself. What makes this so difficult to catch in your own life is that a wish disguises itself as effort. Curtis wasn't sitting idle. He was reading, listening, highlighting, visualizing, activity that felt, from the inside, indistinguishable from progress. And that's exactly the trap, because motion and decision are not the same thing, no matter how similar they feel while you're the one in motion. You can run in place for 13 years and burn every bit as much energy as someone sprinting forward the entire time, and only one of those two people will ever end up somewhere different from where they started. I asked Curtis one more question that evening, the one I think you should be asking yourself right now, quietly, before I go any further. Not whether he wanted to be rich. He'd already answered that 100 times without it changing anything. I asked him what he was actually protecting by never deciding. He didn't answer right away, and the silence that followed told me more than anything he eventually said. What Curtis was protecting, it turned out, once he finally said it out loud, wasn't his savings account or his current job. It was the version of himself that other people still believed in. His brother-in-law thought he was working on something. His co-workers assumed he was still deciding the right move. His own kids, old enough by then to notice these things, had absorbed a quiet family story that Dad had a plan, a real one, that was simply taking its time. The moment he committed fully and it failed in front of all of them, he wouldn't just be losing money. He'd be losing the story everyone around him had also agreed to believe. I think this is the part almost nobody accounts for when they talk about why people stay stuck, because it makes the whole thing sound selfish or fearful in a way that misses what's actually happening. Curtis wasn't a coward. He was doing something psychologists have a name for, something far more common than the rare cases where it gets talked about openly. It's called self-handicapping, the tendency to quietly arrange, in advance, a built-in excuse for a failure you haven't even attempted yet, specifically so that if it happens, it won't say anything permanent about who you are. A student who parties the night before a big exam instead of sleeping isn't necessarily reckless. Some part of them may be making sure that if the grade comes back low, it was the partying's fault, never a verdict on their actual intelligence. Curtis's version of the same maneuver was never fully starting. If he never really tried, the failure that never technically happened couldn't be used as evidence against the man everyone, including himself, still believed he might become. Once you see this mechanism clearly, you start noticing it everywhere, and I guess, if you're honest with yourself right now, you can already feel where it's been quietly operating in your own life. The business idea you've mentioned to exactly 3 people, always followed by eventually, never by a date. The savings goal you've adjusted downward twice in the last 2 years, each time telling yourself it was being realistic rather than admitting it was retreating. The conversation about a career change you've had in your head 50 times and out loud 0 times. Because as long as it stays in your head, it can still turn out to be brilliant, untested, unfalsified, safe. Here's the part that should actually unsettle you more than anything Curtis told me directly. Self-handicapping doesn't feel like fear from the inside. It feels like patience. It feels like prudence. It feels, in the moment, like the mature, responsible choice. Waiting for better timing, building more of a cushion, making sure the plan is airtight before committing to it. That disguise is exactly what makes it so durable. Nobody sits down and consciously thinks, I am now going to sabotage my own future to protect my ego. They think, I just want to be smart about this. And 13 years pass while being smart about it quietly does the work that outright avoidance never could have gotten away with, because outright avoidance would have been too obvious to ignore. Napoleon Hill wrote about the difference between people who reach decisions quickly and hold to them, and people who reach decisions slowly, if at all, and change them often, and he was direct about which pattern he found, again and again, in the people who never built anything lasting. He wasn't describing recklessness. He was describing the willingness to let a decision cost something, to let it be real enough that walking it back would actually hurt, rather than keeping every decision soft enough to abandon quietly the moment it got uncomfortable. That willingness is rarer than talent. It's rarer than a good idea. Most people have had a good idea. Very few have ever let one cost them something on purpose. I want to ask you something before I go further into what actually changed for Curtis, because I think this next part will land differently depending on your honest answer. Somewhere in the last few minutes, a specific version of your own someday probably surfaced, quietly, maybe uncomfortably, in a way you didn't expect from a video like this. If you felt that, and you're done letting it stay soft, done letting it be something you're still deciding rather than something you've actually decided, type "I am ready" in the comments right now. Not as a slogan you'll forget by tomorrow, as the first sentence of a decision instead of another sentence in a 13-year-old wish. I read every one of them, and there's a specific reason that exact phrase matters more than it sounds like it should, one I'm going to come back to before this video is over. Before I tell you what actually happened to Curtis, I want to back up and ask a question that I think explains why this pattern is so widespread, rather than some rare personal failing that only afflicts a few unlucky people. Where does the habit of keeping every door open actually come from? Because nobody's born believing that optionality is wisdom. Somebody teaches you that early, and so gently you never notice the lesson landing. Think about the advice you were actually handed growing up, the kind repeated so often it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like fact. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Keep your options open. Have a backup plan. Stay well-rounded. Don't burn bridges. Every one of those phrases is genuinely useful in a narrow context. Nobody should sink their entire savings into a single stock, and nobody should torch a real relationship out of spite. But somewhere along the way, that specific, limited financial and social wisdom quietly generalized itself into something far larger and far more damaging. The belief that keeping options open is always the responsible move in every domain, including the one domain where it actively guarantees you never arrive anywhere at all. Nobody sat you down and taught you that diffusion defeats purpose. You absorbed it sideways, the same way most destructive beliefs get absorbed, not as a single dramatic lesson, but as 1,000 small, well-meaning reinforcements from people who loved you and had no idea what they were actually building. Parents anxious about their children's security. Teachers rewarding well-roundedness over depth. A culture that treats keeping your options open as a mark of maturity rather than what it actually is, most of the time, once a real decision is actually called for. A sophisticated way of refusing to choose. Here's the part that makes this worth taking seriously instead of dismissing as a minor cultural quirk. Definiteness of purpose isn't just a matter of willpower or grit, or the kind of thing you can simply decide harder about. It changes something concrete in how your own attention actually operates, and there's real neuroscience behind why. Deep in the brain sits a structure called the reticular activating system, whose job, among other things, is to filter the flood of information reaching you at every moment and decide what's worth your conscious attention and what gets discarded as noise before you're even aware it existed. You felt this system working before, even if you never knew its name. It's the reason that the moment you start seriously considering a particular car, you suddenly start seeing that exact model everywhere, on every street, in every parking lot, as though the world had just filled up with them overnight. The cars were always there. What changed was the filter. A defined purpose does exactly this to opportunity, and almost nobody realizes it's happening in real time. The moment Curtis's counterpart, someone who actually closes the door and commits to one clear target, sets that target, their own filtering system starts flagging every conversation, every article, every casual comment at a dinner party that might be relevant to it, promoting information to conscious attention that would have been silently discarded a week earlier. This isn't mysticism, and it isn't the universe rearranging itself on your behalf. It's a physical mechanism in your own skull, and it simply has nothing to filter for as long as the target itself stays vague. A wish gives the filter nothing specific to haunt. A decision hands it a target, and the target changes what you notice for the rest of the time you hold it. This is closer to what Napoleon Hill meant by definiteness of purpose than most people give him credit for. He wasn't describing blind optimism. He was describing a mechanism. Narrow the aim, and the mind itself begins working differently, noticing differently, connecting differently, in ways a scattered mind structurally cannot. I've walked you through the psychology of why people avoid that narrowing. Now I want to show you exactly what happens on the other side of it, in a case you can't wave away as one man's private anecdote, because it's documented, historical, and involves one of the most striking examples on record of a single decision made in an instant against every reasonable objection available at the time. In the early 1900s, a young man named Edwin Barnes arrived at Thomas Edison's laboratory in New Jersey with almost nothing to his name. He hadn't come by passenger train because he couldn't afford the ticket. He'd traveled the way people traveled when they had no other option, and he showed up at the door of one of the most famous inventors alive looking, by his own later account, like exactly what he was: a man with no money, no connections, and no formal claim to be standing there at all. Here's the detail almost everyone gets wrong when they retell this story, and it's the detail that actually matters. Barnes hadn't come looking for a job. He'd decided, before he ever set foot in that building, that he was going to become Edison's business partner, not an employee, not an assistant, not someone hoping to be noticed and eventually promoted. A partner. He said as much, plainly, the moment he got the chance to say anything at all, and he said it with a kind of certainty that had nothing to do with the actual evidence available to support it, because there wasn't any. He had no product, no capital, no prior relationship with Edison whatsoever. What he had was a decision, made before the outcome had given him a single reason to make it, and he stated it out loud as though the outcome were already settled. Edison himself said, years later, that something about the way this particular young man stood in that room was different from the usual person who showed up wanting something. Most people who approached him were asking for an opportunity, hedging their language, leaving themselves room to retreat gracefully if the answer was no. Barnes wasn't asking. He'd already decided, and the only open question left was how long it would take the rest of the world to catch up to something he'd settled in his own mind before he ever bought that freight ticket. Edison gave him a job, a low one, menial, nothing close to the partnership Barnes had announced. Most people, hearing this part of the story, assume Barnes must have felt humiliated, sweeping floors in a laboratory owned by a man he'd told he was going to do business with. He wasn't. The job was never the point. It was simply where he could stand while he waited for the one moment his decision was actually built for. And he was willing to wait far longer than most people would tolerate waiting for a payoff with no visible timeline attached to it. Here's what I mean by definiteness of purpose closing a door, in the most literal sense this story can show you. Barnes never went back to whatever life he'd left to travel to that laboratory. He didn't keep a return ticket in his pocket as a hedge. He didn't split his attention between this pursuit and some backup plan he could fall into if it didn't pan out within a reasonable window. Every ordinary, sensible piece of advice you've ever been given about keeping your options open, he ignored completely, on purpose, because he understood something most people never let themselves believe until they've already lived it. A mind that still has a way out will eventually take it, the moment the waiting gets uncomfortable enough. He removed the way out before the discomfort ever had the chance to tempt him. Years passed. Barnes stayed near Edison, doing unremarkable work, watching, waiting, with no guarantee any of it would amount to what he'd declared on his first day. Then Edison's laboratory produced a new machine, a dictating device the sales staff weren't especially excited about, uncertain how to position it. Barnes saw what almost nobody else in that building saw, because he'd been positioned, patiently, for years, to be exactly the person ready to see it. He asked for the chance to sell it. He got the exclusive rights to distribute it. What followed made him precisely what he'd told Edison he intended to become the day he first walked through that door with no money and no plan B. Not an employee who'd been generously promoted, but a genuine business partner, wealthy on his own account, standing in a place he'd decided on years before there was a single piece of evidence it was possible. I want you to notice exactly what separates this from Curtis, because it isn't intelligence, and it isn't that Barnes had some advantage Curtis lacked. Curtis kept every door open for 13 years, waiting for proof before he'd commit. Barnes committed with zero proof, and let the commitment itself go looking for the proof afterward. That single reversal, deciding first, evidence later, instead of the other way around, is the entire hinge this video has been circling since the opening line, and I'm not finished showing you what it actually costs to make that reversal yourself. I want to bring this back to you now, because it would be easy to hear the Barnes story and file it away as something that happened to an unusually bold man in a different century, in circumstances nothing like your own. That would be the most comfortable way to watch this video. It would also cost you the only part of it that was ever actually meant for you. So ask yourself, honestly, what your version of the return ticket looks like. Not literally. Almost nobody keeps an actual train ticket in their pocket as a hedge. But everyone has some version of it. The job you haven't fully committed to leaving, kept just current enough that walking back into it wouldn't be humiliating. The savings you're quietly unwilling to touch, even though touching them is what the plan actually requires. The sentence you say to people, "I'm exploring a few different directions," that sounds like flexibility and functions, in practice, as a permanent exit already built into the plan before the plan has even started. You don't need to have a getaway car running outside to be holding a return ticket. You only need one door, anywhere in the structure, still quietly unlocked. There's a reason this feels so difficult to let go of, and it's worth understanding instead of just being told to push through it. The word decide comes from an old root meaning to cut off, the same root sitting underneath words like incision and homicide, words that all share this one idea of severing something cleanly, permanently, with no reattachment implied. That's not a coincidence of language. It's an accurate description of what a real decision actually does. It doesn't add a new option to your life. It amputates the others, and every part of you that's ever avoided a real decision has understood, correctly, on some level, exactly what that word was asking of you. This is why the hesitation you feel isn't weakness, and I don't want you leaving this video thinking Curtis, or anyone who recognizes themselves in him, is simply too soft for what wealth requires. What you're feeling when you resist closing a door is closer to grief than fear, and grief is not an irrational response to loss. It's the correct one. Every time you commit fully to one path, you are, in a very real sense, letting every other version of your life quietly die. The version of you who took the safer job, the version who stayed in the town you grew up in, the version who never risked the savings at all. Barnes didn't feel nothing standing on that laboratory floor with no money and no way home. He felt the full weight of everything he'd just cut away, and he did it anyway, because he'd decided the one path he was keeping mattered more than the mourning required to keep it. Here's the distinction I want to leave with you before I address the objection I know some of you are already forming, because it's a fair one and I'm not going to dodge it. Deciding doesn't mean deciding recklessly, without thought, without accounting for the people who depend on you. It means being honest about which doors are genuinely load-bearing, the ones protecting people who'd actually be harmed if they closed, and which ones are simply comfortable, dressed up in the language of responsibility to disguise what they actually are. Most people, if they're honest, are keeping far more doors open than caution requires. They've simply never separated the door that's protecting someone they love from the door that's only protecting them from having to grieve a version of themselves they were never going to become anyway. I know some of you watching this have real constraints Barnes didn't have: a mortgage, children depending on a steady paycheck, responsibilities that can't simply be walked away from because a video told you to. I'm not dismissing that. and I think it deserves a direct answer rather than being waved past with another story. So let's deal with it honestly, because the answer isn't what most people expect, and it isn't the version of just take the leap you've probably heard from people who never had a mortgage themselves. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly when they tell the Barnes story, and it's the part that actually matters if you have people depending on you. Barnes could burn every boat he owned because he barely had any boats to begin with. No spouse relying on his paycheck, no children who needed a stable roof, nothing waiting for him back home that his disappearance would genuinely harm. That's not a detail to skip past. It's the entire key to applying this honestly instead of recklessly. Definiteness of purpose was never about the size of the boat. It was about whether a real one gets burned at all. Most people here close the door and imagine something dramatic. Quit the job tomorrow, empty the account, tell your family tonight. That's not what the principle requires, and frankly, for most people with real responsibilities, that version would simply be irresponsible dressed up as courage. What the principle actually requires is smaller and, in its own way, harder to hide from. A specific, costly, irreversible action, sized honestly to your real constraints, that proves to your own mind you've actually decided instead of merely intending. I think of a woman I met a while back, a nurse named Elena, mid-30s, 2 kids, a mortgage that genuinely couldn't survive her quitting anything abruptly. She'd wanted to move into real estate for years. She was good with people, good under pressure, understood negotiation instinctively from years of dealing with insurance companies on behalf of patients who couldn't do it themselves. And for years, it stayed exactly where Curtis kept his plan, a wish, discussed occasionally, backed by nothing that would cost her anything if it never happened. What changed wasn't a leap. It was a boat, sized correctly for a woman with 2 kids and a mortgage. She used part of a signing bonus, money she could have quietly folded into savings, the safe and sensible move, to pay, in full, non-refundable, for a licensing course with a hard completion date attached to it. She told her nurse manager directly, by name, on a specific date, that she'd be reducing to part-time hours in 18 months once the license came through, not at some point, not eventually. A date, spoken out loud to a person who would now notice if it didn't happen. Neither of those actions required her to abandon her family's stability. Both of them were real enough, costly enough, specific enough, that walking them back later would have actually stung. That sting is the entire point. A decision that costs nothing to reverse was never a decision. It was a preference wearing a decision's clothes. 18 months later, she made the transition, on the date she'd said out loud a year and a half earlier, to people who remembered she'd said it. I don't tell you this to suggest it was easy, or that every month of that stretch felt certain. She told me later there were nights she lay awake wondering if she'd been foolish to spend that bonus on a course instead of the emergency fund. But the deadline held, because she'd made it cost something in advance, and a mind that's already paid a price for a direction tends to keep walking in it, if only because walking away would mean admitting the price was wasted. This is the actual answer to the objection about mortgages and children and responsibilities that can't simply be abandoned. Nobody's asking you to abandon them. What's being asked is smaller and considerably more honest. Pick one door, right now, that you've been keeping unlocked out of habit rather than genuine necessity, and close it in a way that costs you something real if you go back on it. Not your family's security, not your children's stability. One door, sized to your actual life, that turns a wish you could still be having in another 13 years into a decision with a date, a cost, and a witness attached to it. Napoleon Hill never argued that desire alone builds wealth, whatever the diluted version of his ideas circulating online might suggest. He was explicit that desire has to be backed by a definite plan and by action taken immediately, however small that first action is, because a desire that never converts into a specific, costly first step is simply a wish with better branding. Elena's first step was a course and a date. Barnes's first step was a freight ticket he couldn't really afford. Yours doesn't have to look like either of theirs. It only has to be real enough that reversing it would genuinely hurt. I've been talking to you about Curtis and Elena and a man who traveled by freight train more than 100 years ago, as though I discovered this pattern purely by watching other people from a safe distance. That's not entirely honest, and I think it's time I told you where I actually learned it, because it wasn't in a book. For years before any of this existed, I had a steady, unremarkable job that paid on time and asked very little of me beyond showing up and doing competent work. I also had, running quietly underneath that job, an idea for something of my own, vague at first, then less vague, then detailed enough that I could have described it to you in an hour if you'd asked. What I never had, for a long stretch of years I'd genuinely rather not add up out loud, was a date. I had enthusiasm. I had notebooks full of outlines. What I didn't have was a single moment where the idea had cost me anything, and I've since come to believe that's the only honest test of whether an idea is a decision or simply a very persistent daydream. The day that changed wasn't dramatic, and I want to be accurate about that instead of making it sound more cinematic than it actually was. I didn't wake up one morning transformed by sudden courage. What happened is that I finally did one specific, boring, irreversible thing. I gave notice, in writing, with an exact date on it, before I had a single dollar of income lined up to replace what I was walking away from. Not because I calculated it was safe. It wasn't especially safe. I did it because I finally understood, the way you understand something only after circling it for years, that as long as the notice stayed unwritten, the entire project would keep living exactly where it had always lived, in the category of things I fully intended to do, someday, once conditions improved enough to make it comfortable. I remember sitting with that letter for longer than it should have taken to write 4 sentences. Every version of the sensible argument showed up in that hour, each one dressed slightly differently. You could give it 3 more months and build a bigger cushion first. You could keep the job and do this on weekends until it proves itself. You could wait until the timing is less complicated than it currently is. Every one of those arguments was, on its own terms, reasonable. And I recognized, sitting there, that reasonable was exactly the disguise the wish had been wearing for years, and that if I listened to it one more time, I'd still be listening to a version of it a decade later, the way Curtis was still listening to his version 13 years in. What actually happened after I turned in that letter wasn't relief, and it wasn't confidence either. It was something closer to what I imagine Barnes felt watching that laboratory door close behind him, a kind of clean, uncomfortable seriousness that hadn't been there the day before, because the day before, none of it had cost anything yet. The income didn't show up immediately. There were months I genuinely didn't know if the decision had been right, months where the old job's steady paycheck looked, in memory, considerably more appealing than it had ever looked while I was still collecting it. But the date had already passed. The letter had already been read. There was no version of that particular Tuesday left to walk back, and something about that fact, uncomfortable as it was, kept me moving in a way 13 years of enthusiasm never had. I'm not telling you this so you'll think I was especially brave, because I wasn't, not in the moment. I was scared writing that letter, in a plain, unglamorous way that had nothing to do with the confident tone people expect from a story like this once it's finished and being told after the fact. What I want you to take from it instead is smaller and, I think, more useful than bravery. The fear didn't go away before I acted. It went away afterward, slowly, only because there was no longer a door left open for it to keep arguing through. If any part of what I've just told you sounds like your own unwritten letter, your own idea with no date attached to it yet, I'm not going to pretend the fear disappears the moment you finally write it. What I can tell you is exactly what starts to change once you do, and precisely what to do first, tonight, with whatever door just came to mind while you were listening. Start here, because it costs you nothing except a few minutes of honesty you've probably been avoiding. Write down, in one sentence, the specific thing you actually want. Not financial freedom, not more security, which are the vague, comfortable phrases that let you feel like you're aiming at something while actually aiming at nothing precise enough to act on. Curtis wanted to build wealth for 13 years, and that phrase was exactly loose enough to never require a single concrete step. Barnes didn't want to do well in business. He wanted to become Edison's partner. Name your actual target with that same specificity, even if naming it plainly makes you a little uncomfortable. Vagueness was never humility. It was the wish protecting itself from ever being tested. Second, find your return ticket, because you have one, whether you've noticed it yet or not. Somewhere in your plan is a door you've left quietly unlocked, one that lets you retreat without it costing you anything visible. It might be the savings account you'd never actually touch. It might be the vague timeline that lets someday keep stretching indefinitely. Name it specifically, the same way I asked you to name Curtis's cushion and his hard conversation he kept postponing. You can't close a door you haven't admitted is still open. Third, choose a boat sized to your actual life, not to Barnes's, not to mine, not to anyone else's circumstances but your own. If you have people depending on you, this isn't permission to be reckless. It's an instruction to be specific instead of vague about the cost. A non-refundable deposit on a course. A resignation letter with a real date on it, even if that date is months out. A public statement to one person whose opinion you actually care about, made in a way you couldn't quietly walk back without them noticing. The size can flex to match your responsibilities. Whether something real gets burned cannot. Fourth, attach a date and a witness to whatever you choose, because a decision with no deadline and no one watching is simply a private hope with slightly better posture. Elena told her manager 18 months, by name, out loud. I filed a letter with an exact date on it. Pick the date before you feel ready, because readiness is a feeling that a wish can manufacture indefinitely without ever requiring anything of you. And pick someone to tell who will actually remember, someone who'll ask you about it later whether you want them to or not. Fifth, take one physical action within the next 24 hours, something small enough to actually do and specific enough that it moves the decision out of your head and into the world where it can start being real. Send the email. Make the appointment. Say the sentence out loud to the person it needs saying to. This isn't about momentum in the vague, motivational sense people usually mean. It's about giving your own attention something concrete to organize itself around before the old, comfortable vagueness has a chance to quietly reclaim the territory. And finally, understand that the decision won't feel finished once you've made it. It will need to be renewed, quietly, on the exact mornings it feels most tempting to reopen the door you closed. Because closing a door once doesn't make you immune to wanting it back the first time things get uncomfortable. Barnes almost certainly had mornings, sweeping that laboratory floor, where the freight ticket home would have looked appealing if he'd let himself dwell on it. What separated him wasn't the absence of that temptation. It was refusing to act on it, morning after morning, for as long as it took the decision to stop needing to be defended at all. None of this will feel dramatic while you're doing it. And I think that's exactly why so few people follow through once the initial resolve fades. There's a piece of the Barnes story I haven't told you yet, and it isn't about him. It's about everyone else in that building who had the exact same proximity to the exact same opportunity, and never once made the one decision that would have let them reach for it. Thomas Edison's laboratory in those years wasn't a small operation. Dozens of men worked in that building, some of them with real technical training Barnes never had. Some of them who'd been on staff for years before he ever showed up with no money and a declaration nobody had asked him to make. When the dictating machine came out of that lab, every one of them had, in some sense, the same proximity to it that Barnes did. They walked past it in the hallway. They knew it existed before most of the country did. Access was never the scarce resource in that building. It was sitting right there, in plain view, for anyone who worked there to notice. What almost none of them had was the thing Barnes had walked in the door already carrying. They had jobs. Good ones, by the standards of the time, steady, respectable, attached to one of the most admired names in American industry. And a job, once it's comfortable enough, has a way of quietly absorbing a person's entire sense of ambition, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulated weight of a paycheck that keeps arriving whether or not you ever declare what you actually want beyond it. Most of those men would likely have told you, if you'd asked, that they wanted more eventually, a promotion, a bit more security, maybe something of their own someday. Not one of them, as far as the record shows, ever stood in that building and said, out loud, to the man who owned it, that he intended to become his partner. Proximity to opportunity was never rationed in that room. Definiteness was. I think about Curtis every time I revisit this part of the story, because he was standing exactly as close to his own version of that machine as Barnes ever stood to his. Closer, in some ways, given everything else Curtis had going for him that Barnes never had. What Curtis lacked wasn't opportunity. It was the sentence Barnes said out loud on his first day, the one that turned a menial, unremarkable job into a waiting room instead of a destination. I'll tell you what actually happened to Curtis, because I think you've earned the ending rather than being left to guess at it. He didn't quit his job the week after that conversation, and I want to be honest that nothing about what followed looked cinematic. What he did, about 6 weeks later, was set a date, 10 months out, by which he'd either have his side business generating enough to justify the leap, or he'd shut the idea down permanently and stop telling himself the story that had kept him circling it for 13 years. He told his wife the actual number, not a vague hope, but a figure, written down, taped inside the same closet door the old vision board had quietly occupied for years. He spent real money on a course he couldn't get refunded. He told 2 colleagues, by name, what the date was, knowing they'd ask him about it whether he wanted them to or not. It didn't go the way Barnes's story went, and I think that's actually the more useful ending for you to hear, because most decisions don't produce a fortune inside of a decade. What it produced was smaller and, in its own way, more important. Curtis hit his number 4 months late, not 10, close enough that he made the leap anyway. On a revised date, he said out loud the same way he'd set the first one. The business he built isn't a legend. It pays his bills, comfortably, in a way the job never would have on its own trajectory. But that's not really the part worth sitting with. The part worth sitting with is that somewhere around month 7 of that 10-month window, he told me the fear hadn't gone anywhere. It just stopped being the only voice in the room, because for the first time in 13 years, there was a date standing across from it, refusing to move. Access was never Curtis's problem, the same way it was never the problem for the other men in that laboratory who watched a machine change one man's entire life and changed nothing about their own. The wish was always available to both of them. What Barnes had, and what Curtis eventually built for himself, wasn't a better opportunity than everyone else standing near the same one. It was the one sentence almost nobody in that building or in your own life, right now, has actually said out loud yet. At the start of this video, I told you there's a specific moment, about 4 seconds long, that separates the person who eventually becomes wealthy from the person who spends a lifetime wishing they were. I didn't tell you what those 4 seconds actually contain, because I wanted you to recognize it yourself somewhere in the last several minutes, rather than have me hand it to you like a definition. You already know now. It's the 4 seconds it takes to say a sentence out loud instead of keeping it safely unsaid, to a spouse, to a manager, to yourself in an empty room, to whoever needs to hear it before it can start costing you anything real. A man with no money and no return ticket said one sentence in a laboratory that didn't belong to him, and spent years sweeping floors before the world caught up to what he'd already decided. A woman with 2 kids and a mortgage spent part of a bonus on a class she couldn't get refunded and told one date to one person who would remember it. A man circled the exact same want for 13 years, changed nothing about the size of his ambition, and changed everything the moment he wrote a number on a piece of paper and taped it where he'd see it every morning. None of them were braver than you. None of them had access you don't already have, sitting somewhere in your own life right now, close enough to touch, waiting on nothing but the sentence. I'm not going to tell you the fear disappears once you say it. It didn't for any of them, and I doubt it will for you either. What I can tell you is that a wish stops being able to run your life quietly, in the background, dressed up as patience, the moment you finally give it a date and a witness and something real to cost you. Everything after that is slower than anyone wants it to be, and realer than any amount of wanting ever managed to be on its own. The door doesn't close because you noticed it was open. It closes because you finally reached over and shut it. On an ordinary day, nobody else was watching closely enough to call historic. Somewhere in your life right now, there's a version of Curtis's closet door, Barnes's freight ticket, Elena's non-refundable course, something you've been circling for years, describing with real feeling to anyone who'll listen, and never once let cost you anything if it doesn't happen. I don't know your exact version of it. I only know, after everything I've shown you tonight, that almost everyone carries one, usually well disguised as prudence, usually mistaken for patience, usually still sitting exactly where it was sitting a year ago. You're not behind for having one. Curtis had one for 13 years. Barnes was standing in a laboratory with nothing to his name when he finally said his out loud. What separates what came next was never the absence of a wish. Everyone has a wish. What separates it is whether it ever became a sentence specific enough, costly enough, dated enough, to stop being a wish at all. I think about that distinction more than almost anything else in this story, not because it resolves neatly, but because it never needs to. Nobody gets handed a fortune for wanting one badly enough. What gets handed to the very few who ever build one is smaller, stranger, and far more available than talent or luck ever were. A single afternoon, unremarkable in every visible way, where a person finally stopped rehearsing the sentence in private and said it, once, to someone who could hold them to it. There's a sentence sitting in you right now, close enough to say, that you haven't said yet. You already know which one. If tonight was the night that sentence finally got close enough to say, follow this channel before you close the video, because there's more of this waiting for the week you're finally ready to say it. And if you know 5 people still circling their own version of Curtis's 13 years, send this to them. You might be the reason one of them finally sets the date.